Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, January 30th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santamaria. And as always, right at the top of the show, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Talk Nerdy is 100% free to download, which means that we don't make money on it unless we sell ads or it's supported by listeners just like you, kind of the PBS NPR model. And I really, really do appreciate the ongoing support from so many of you over the years. If you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart. All right, so this week I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Gloria Mark. She is a Chancellor's Professor in the Department of Informatics at University of California, Irvine. And she has, well, actually, before I tell you about her book, her research area is on human-computer interaction. She looks at how technology interplays with individuals, groups, and society. Specifically, she studies how people interact with information technology in their everyday life and how it affects their multitasking, attention, mood, and stress. So she has a new book, and we get into it. It is called Attention Span, a groundbreaking way to restore balance, happiness, and productivity. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Gloria Mark. Well, Gloria, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So you are over there on the West Coast, the best coast, as I like to call it, back near my home in LA. You're in Irvine, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Awesome. Because you're at UC Irvine. And you did your PhD from Columbia and you studied psychology. What was your focus back when you were studying psychology? Was it more applied? Was it more research oriented?
It was research oriented. It was cognitive psychology. Mm-hmm. And my focus was on decision making.
And so that's obviously a very broad topic. Were you looking at a very particular paradigm? Were you looking at how people make decisions, how to influence decisions? What was kind of your take?
So I was very inspired by the work of Kahneman and Tversky, mm-hmm. and they looked at biases in decision making and the kinds of heuristics that people commonly use when they make decisions. And I wanted to see if there were any cases where people actually could apply statistical principles in making decisions. In other words, are people always subject to biases? Are there ever cases where people can reason use statistics in their intuitive judgments. So I did find that there were two cases. And one is that if people are in a group setting and you're discussing a problem and someone comes up with an answer that's based on statistical reasoning, like what's mm-hmm. called the law of large numbers, everybody resonates with that and they agree with it. It's like a eureka finding. So even though there might be alternative proposals that are mentioned, everyone tends to agree with the one that involves statistical reasoning. The law of large numbers basically says that you should, you can't make a reasoned decision based on a very small sample. It's just not representative of the underlying population. So you need a larger number to be able to make a decision. So, reasoning in a group and having someone come up with the correct answer was one case. And the other case is if people are presented with analogies, and embedded in the analogies is statistical reasoning. People can resonate with that. They understand that. In other words, people may not understand abstract statistical reasoning. But if you take that reasoning and you put it into a story, then it makes so much sense to people. They can understand it. And an example would be, let's say, a dancer who usually performs really well in auditions, and then one time just happens to blow it, right? And just does really badly. When you read that story, you understand that this is just not representative of this dancer's ability. But yet, what people generally do is they'll look at this one shot from the dancer, and then they tend to generalize to the entire dancer's performance. So
Right.
dancers, actors, anyone who does an audition understands that sometimes you have good days and sometimes you have bad days, but a single instance is just not representative of the sum total of all your abilities.
Well, I think it's refreshing, and it gives me hope that these were the findings of your dissertation research, because I sometimes worry that, I mean, kind of part of what I do in the other part of my career, which is working in scientific skepticism and on another podcast called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, we're often talking about this very thing, about sort of using evidence-based practice and kind of understand, using neuropsychological humility to understand our biases and kind of catch ourselves and be a little bit more, I guess, logical in our approach to the world. And ultimately, there are so many examples that I can point to where people do, sadly, the opposite. They will make these massive cognitive errors that fly in the face of statistics, like you see it with like the gambling fallacy or something like that, or somebody thinks they're on a hot streak or they're on a bender, or like on a heater. And it's like, no, this is all random. But it's hard for people to think that way.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But it's good to know then that in kind of a group dynamic, when somebody comes up with a logical, or as you mentioned, a statistically sort of founded or based argument, that it is quite persuasive.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because this seems to be independent of group dynamics. So sometimes you have a very dominant person in a group, but even if that dominant person says an answer that's not according to correct statistical reasoning, people don't respond to it. They respond to maybe that quiet person in the group who comes up with the more accurate response. That's what they respond to.
I can imagine so many people who are listening to this recording right now being like, how do you explain Donald Trump? But we will put that on the shelf, and we will switch gears, I think, because I really want to talk to you about your new book and about this kind of new area that you've decided to write about and dive into. So your book is called Attention Span: Finding Focus and Fighting Distraction. And of course, your sort of career in cognitive psychology and the work that you do, this is so interesting because you've done a bunch of research in more like the tech sector, kind of looking at human computer interaction. So actually, before we get into like, the top line, what you're trying to teach us in this book, I'd love to know how you went from sort of classic laboratory cognitive psychology into this more I guess you could call it translational or like applied area where you're looking at the way that humans interact with technology.
Yeah, that's interesting. So when I was in graduate school, my advisor had worked at Bell Labs. And Bell Labs at the time was, the premier, I would really say it was one of the premier scientific research institutes in the country. And it was, to me, it seemed like, wow, this would be an amazing place to work in a research laboratory. I wasn't so tied to academia because, as you know, in academia, you have to go to where the jobs are. And I might be offered a job in some part of the country that I may not want to live in. I like cities or urban areas, and maybe I would get a job that was more in a rural area. So I was very open to the idea that I could work in a research laboratory. And when I graduated, there was an opportunity to work at, there was a company called Electronic Data Systems, and they
Mm-hmm.
had set up a research lab. And this was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I first started out in Ann Arbor and then quickly switched to Cambridge. And it was very interesting because they had the sense to realize that they needed a psychologist to understand how people use technology. And they were looking for someone who understood group psychology because they had set up this state of the art conference room where computers were networked together and everything was networked to a big screen, and they had, all this really cool software to support meetings and decision making, and it was just a perfect fit. And now no one would blink if they walked into an electronic conference room. But
Right. Yeah.
this was in the 1990s, and I felt like, wow, this is amazing. I've stepped into the future, and I was very excited about technology. And so that's how I got into it. And then I met my husband, and we moved to Germany. And I worked in a German research institute. It's called the German National Research Center for Information Technology, probably the largest research institute in Europe. It's now called Fraunhofer, which some people might have heard of. And there I really was able to work on a number of different projects related to, how people interact with, various kinds of programs. And we looked at, for example, the very early virtual worlds. That was very exciting. And we looked at all kinds of telecooperation. It was called telecooperation, telecommunication systems where people could, work remotely. Groups could work remotely and exchange documents and communications. And it was just, at the time, was very, very new, and it was just like a huge playground for a psychologist like myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to think, just the difference between how technology, I mean, how do I put this? So I'm of an era, I'm 39 years old. So I'm of this like really kind of interesting, I guess you could call me an older millennial, where when I was born and when I was going through early development, there was not a lot of interface with screens. We definitely had television, but I wasn't, there were no iPads and nobody was on an iPhone yet. I think my first telephone that I had personally was when I was like maybe 17, 18 years old. I had like one of those old school Nokia phones. There were a couple of experimental classrooms in my elementary school that had computers, but it wasn't really until high school that I was like online. So that's sort of where my development was. Of course, kids growing up today are like what we call digital natives, right? They're just, it's intuitive for them and they're growing up with all of this technology all around them. And then there are individuals like yourself who you just described sort of the landscape of the 90s when you were already in your career and the transitions that you saw kind of throughout. And it's fascinating to think that when you first sort of approached these technological advances from a psychological perspective, like where was your mind initially? Was it, wow, this is the future. I'm so excited for the opportunities for human potential here. Was it, oh gosh, I'm really nervous about how this is going to affect our cognitive functioning? Was it a little bit ambivalent, like a little column A, a little column B? I'm curious how you first felt when you dove into this sort of aspect of your career, and then how that's sort of changed over the years.
Yeah, I wasn't skeptical at all.
Okay.
I was very excited. I was very enthusiastic. It was so new. And, of course, at the time, we didn't have social media, we didn't have misinformation, we didn't have cyberbullying. And so, I was just seeing the potential. And, I was very idealistic. I'm still very optimistic about the potential for technology. I'm a little bit more sober, perhaps, about the positive and negative of technology. But at the time, I just saw this as the future. There was so much potential. I saw the benefits that technology could bring. And for example, in these early virtual worlds, I was so excited about being able to connect with people from all over the world. Now, no one blinks about it.
Right.
No one thinks twice. But I remember I was doing research in a particular virtual world. It was very sophisticated. It was called OnLive Traveler, and it had what was called spatial audio. That was very new technology. And basically what it means is if you're navigating through a graphical virtual environment, the closer you get to someone, the louder is their voice.
Right.
And if your avatar is positioned next to another person, you hear mumbling unless you actually turn your avatar to face them. If you face each other, then the voices become clear. Just it mimics our social conventions in real life, right? If it's not socially appropriate to stand next to someone and not look at them if you're having a conversation. So the technology forced us to perform these social conventions. And I remember one time, going into OnLive Traveler, and I was like an ethnographer. I was taking notes and observing, and I see that one day there's something called Japan World, and I click on it, and it was an environment that some people in Japan had constructed using the software that was available. And so I navigated over to these people. We were all avatars, so you couldn't actually see what the faces looked like. And I was very excited to interact with people in Japan. I had never been to Japan. So what was really interesting was that when I approached these people, they did something very strange with their avatars. They would move them in a strange way. And I couldn't figure out what they were doing. And then I suddenly realized they were bowing. They were moving their avatars to bow. And then because their English was not great, and I don't speak any Japanese, it was also interesting that when I would speak to them, I would move my avatar closer, right, to get the spatial audio optimally, speak to them, and then I would move back to maintain a social distance. Again, it was practicing a social convention. And they would do the same. And it was really funny because when I slowly moved closer and closer because Americans tend to have a shorter social distance between people than people in Japan. And they would back up. And so they probably thought, oh, this aggressive American is, invading our personal space. But it was so interesting that people had transferred their social conventions that they use in real life into these environments. And that was the part that surprised me and that I just found so interesting.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think a question I'm always sort of juggling in my mind, and I don't know if we fully have an answer. I don't know if we ever will fully have an answer, but I do know that there are some labs that are researching it now. I just covered a very recently published article on another podcast I work on. Has to do with sort of exactly what you're talking about, that translation of IRL, real life, real world social cognition and sort of like social intelligence, and all of the conventions that we use and the micro expressions and the understandings that we have when we're in meet space with each other, and how that actually does translate to the digital world. Because we know that a lot of things do translate, but we also know that it's not one to one. And I just covered this story, and I'm going to butcher this, but where some researchers were using a type of EEG that measures synchronous brain waves across two subjects at the same time who are engaged in a social interaction. And they found that when a mom and their child were engaging through like Zoom, as opposed to engaging in real space, there were significantly less synchronous brain regions. And that was like worrisome to the researchers, because they were looking at a child during like, an important stage of sort of social cognitive development. And so I'm really curious. I mean, we're going to get deeply into attention soon, but I'm really curious what you think about the fact that like there are so many things that do translate to our sort of digital worlds, but there are probably a lot of things that don't, that might actually be lacking when we're engaging digitally as opposed to engaging face to face, right?
Yeah. So the results of this study make a lot of sense to me, because in real life we have so many social cues available to us. We have visual information. We can see the person's full body. We see their gestures. A child has a particular body stance. If it's a baby, we see the baby crawling or sitting. So there's so much visual information available to us. And of course, the environment creates a context in which we can act in. And, if you're outside in a park, you behave differently than if you're in a candlelit dining room with your partner. So the context affects things. And of course, if you're on a Zoom call or video call, the cues you receive are so limited. And, even though you're seeing a person in 3 dimensions, it's still a 2-dimensional screen. And so you're really just getting very, very limited information about that individual, and you're not seeing their gestures. Facial expressions aren't as clear as if you're face to face. And of course, we know from a lot of research in human computer interaction that people are just less spontaneous when they interact over electronic communications compared to face to face. And I've seen this myself. I used to study groups in conference rooms face to face versus remote. And in conference rooms, you see people a lot more joking and laughter, a lot more spontaneity, a lot more sidebar conversations with the person next to them. A lot of technology it's not set up for these kinds of sidebar conversations. We see talking heads on the screen. And so we're just seeing the smallest fraction of information that's available about individuals when we interact through video and audio compared to real life.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that the researchers that I found fascinating in this particular study is that they did not study this explicitly, but they posed in the discussion an open-ended question, kind of calling for more research, that perhaps this is part of the reason that people verbalize experiencing what they call Zoom fatigue, where they're like more tired after being in Zoom meetings versus in-person meetings. And they hypothesize that perhaps this is because you're having to actually expend a lot more energy attending or attempting sort of these, what we think of as these more automatic cognitive processes, where basically, as they mentioned, they found 9 areas when people were face to face in person of kind of neural synchrony using, EEG is pretty broad, so they were like large regions of the brain, but they found 9 specific, and they were cross hemisphere, on the same hemisphere. They were region to region. There were like a bunch of different combinations, but they only found 1 when they were looking at the exact same couplings across Zoom. And so they hypothesized maybe because your brain isn't naturally oscillating at these same frequencies, and you're not synchronous in this almost like passive, you don't even realize you're doing it kind of way, you're having to make up for that by expending a lot of energy trying to read people's social cues. You don't even realize you're doing it, but it's like exhausting to you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Another thing is that we tend to schedule Zoom meetings back to back without
right.
any break in between.
Yeah.
And in the physical office, people also have meetings, but there's usually space between meetings, or even walking to a conference room gives you a transition from your office to the meeting, or walking from one meeting room to another gives you a bit of a transition. You usually get a bit of exercise. But when we're on Zoom, we're just sitting, and we tend to schedule Zoom meetings one right after the other without any transition. And so you're moving from one context right into another context. And of course, sitting long stretches is just it's not a good idea. It's not healthy for anyone. Let me point out that I did look at the percent of time that people were sedentary in their office over the years. And this is earlier work. It's not my research, but there was early work done in the 50s and 60s that found that, people spent something like 30%. I have the exact statistics in my book, but something like 30% of the time was spent at the desk, and a lot of the other time was walking around, maybe going to meetings, speaking with colleagues in their offices. And in 2019, we did a study, and we had 750 people wearing, they were wearables, and we used sensors that could detect if they were in their office at their desk or not.
Okay.
And we measured these 750 people over the course of a year and found about 90% of the time when they were in their office, they're at their desk. So, this was right before the pandemic. So you can imagine that after the pandemic, we might even expect that percentage to be higher. So, people are spending a lot of time at their desks,
just sitting, yeah,
and in front of their screens, most likely. So, and doing video conferencing. So even before Zoom, there was a lot of video conferencing, desktop conferencing, audio conferencing going on. So our days are comprised of a lot of this kind of communication with other people, email, Slack.
Right. So given that we know that like a huge percentage of most of the sort of, not all, but most of the sort of, I guess, vocational sector and educational sector, just life sector, just most people who are alive on the planet are spending so much time in front of screens. Let's dive in a little bit into some of the, I guess, the lessons, the things to think about that you discuss in your book. And I think before we even talk about the findings and the things that you discuss, maybe we should define what is attention. When we talk about attention, I think psychologists perhaps think about attention in a way that's slightly different than the sort of quote general public does. So tell me a little bit about how you would define what attention is and what people need to know when we have a conversation about attention.
Mm-hmm. I like to go back to William James,
Okay.
who is known as the father of psychology. And in the 19th century, he defined attention as, and I have a quote here in front of me. I can read this. He says, "Everyone knows what attention is. It's the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought." Of course, everyone knows what attention is. We all know what attention is. But I don't think that James got the full picture, even though he was such a pioneer in psychology. Uh, yes, attention can be under your control, like James talked about. So, according to James, we can control where we place our attention. Yes, it's possible. This kind of attention is called controlled processing. It's also called endogenous attention, which means it's goal oriented from inside of us. Depending on what our goal is, we pay attention to that, which is our goal. If my goal is to do my work, I'm going to pay attention to that. If my goal is to plant in my garden, I'm going to pay attention to that. But attention can also be automatic. And so from an evolutionary perspective, we responded to danger signals in the environment. But in our current times, we've evolved to respond automatically to signals in our current environment, especially signals that grab our attention. So things like blinking lights, which can be notifications on our computer screens, or targeted ads that use our digital information to create profiles about us, and that can really tap into basic emotions that we might respond to depending on our personality type. So if you're an extrovert, you might respond to some kind of information compared to if you're an introvert. This kind of attention that comes from outside, that's directed from things that are outside of us, things from the environment, that's called exogenous attention.
Yeah. Yeah. And so clearly as you even pointed to, but just to reinforce, our attentional capacity, capability, and even I don't even want to talk about it like it's a capacity, but just our attentional experiences are like wildly different now than they were if we look at this from an evolutionary perspective, right? And people like marketers, individuals who work in these sort of capitalist ventures, they understand this. Like
Yes.
they know their stuff, and they know how to say, okay, what is the thing? Like you mentioned, a blinking light, for example, something that simple. But how do I tap into this very deep, almost evolutionarily old part of our development to say you won't be able to help but pay attention to this thing, and my whole goal is getting your eyeballs on my app or my ad or my screen.
Yeah. So, a lot of people are smart enough to turn off notifications and block ads, but there's so many people using the internet that, of course, digital marketers are going to get through and reach some people. But it turns out that people are just as likely to interrupt themselves as to be interrupted from some external notification. So I don't have notifications on, but I interrupt myself. We all do. And we find that about 49% of the time, people interrupt themselves. Why do we interrupt ourselves? Well, and I think everyone can relate to this. We might have an urge we have to check email, or an urge to look at your phone. There might be something new there. We, we have a memory that we forgot to do something, and suddenly I have to stop what I'm doing and write that email or make that phone call or look up that information because I forgot about it. There's so many reasons why we self-interrupt. We might be bored with our task, or maybe the task it's just too hard, and we just can't feel that we don't have the energy right now to tackle it. So we quickly self-interrupt and do something else. So there's so many reasons why we self-interrupt, but we do it a lot. And when people talk about, the internet, it's interrupting us so much, we have to realize that half the time the interruptions come from within ourselves.
Yeah, and do you think that those interruptions, I guess this may be an unanswerable question, but those interruptions that are coming within ourselves are um, exacerbated by our relationship with technology? Like, would we be interrupting ourselves on the savannah or like in the rainforest in that same way? Or is it that pull towards that sort of dopamine hit that we get, that pull towards, oh, I've got to get a new update. I want to see, like, because I find myself doing it while I'm watching a television show that is sufficiently entertaining to me. Like, I'll be watching something and I'll be into the story, but I'll still, like, just without realizing it, pick up my phone and like open the Instagram app and kind of scroll through stories.
Sure, of course, technology plays a role. I don't think we can deny that. In fact, we looked at our data and we divided our data up in terms of interruptions that came from external events, that a notification or a phone call, something that came from something outside of the individual. And then we also looked at interruptions that originated from within the person. And we looked at these on an hourly basis. And we find that when the number of external interruptions declined, that in the next hour, the amount of internal or self interruptions increased. And it suggests to me that we have become conditioned or habituated to have these short attention spans. And if we're not being interrupted by something outside of ourselves, then we interrupt ourselves. So certainly technology plays a role. And but I don't know historically how distracted people actually were, right? So I can't speak to that. I can only say that, this is what people do since we started measuring this about 20 years ago.
So I'm super curious then, obviously what we know, I mean, we know this, like, working in a psychology field, it's like you cannot ignore or deny the kind of irrefutable evidence that multitasking is garbage. Like, people aren't good at it. People think that they're good at it, but they're not good at it. It always pulls your attention. Like, it's a zero-sum game. You can only attend so much to so many things. So when you're trying to do more things at once, all of those things that you're trying to do suffer. Like, we know this, but it feels like there's still a lot of conventional wisdom that it's better to do lots of things at once than to do one thing at a time. And maybe it's just because it's almost impossible in the modern world to do one thing at a time. Like, our world is not built for that. But I'm just curious, sort of in your research, obviously you're looking at things as they are, but what kinds of outcomes or findings have you come across that would maybe be beneficial, like advice, I guess I could say, to help people not multitask so much? Because we all do it all the time, and it's just silly. It's not helpful.
It's not helpful. We know that people make more errors when they multitask. It takes them longer. There's something called a switch cost. So every time you put your attention on a different activity, you have to reorient to that activity.
Yeah.
It's like you have an internal whiteboard in your head, and every time you switch your attention to something new, you have to erase what's on that whiteboard and write this new representation of the task you're doing right now. We have internal representations of what we're doing. And if you're switching really fast, it's like you're erasing that whiteboard, rewriting on it, erasing it, rewriting on it. And sometimes, just like with a whiteboard, sometimes there's a residue. Sometimes you can't erase it completely. And if I'm reading, let's say, a gripping news story, something that just gives me a visceral reaction to it, and then I switch and try to go back to a chapter that I'm writing, I'm still probably going to be thinking about that news story, and it's going to be creating interference with the task I'm trying to do right now. So, switching our attention back and forth like that it's just not a good idea. And, we know in Zoom meetings, some people participate and listen. Other people do their email and which, full disclosure, I've done too. But then you're called on, and it's very obvious you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
Which is, does not make a great impression to your colleagues. It's very disrespectful to the other people in the meeting. And so, so multitasking is not good, and it creates stress. In my research, we've looked at people. We had them wear heart rate monitors, and we used computer logging so we could see how often they were switching screens. And we find a correlation that the faster they switch screens, the heart rate monitors indicate that they're more stressed. So this is, it's not a good thing, and it's just not humanly possible to do two different activities at the same time, unless one of those activities is automatic, that uses this kind of automatic attention, like walking and texting. Walking is automatic, but then, of course, as soon as you happen to notice that there's a street lamp in front of you that you're about to run into, suddenly you stop texting and you pay attention to your environment, and hopefully,
I love
don't run into that.
There's a really fun kind of like street psychology experiment that you can do that's so funny. I recommend anybody try this with one of their colleagues. But if you're walking down, like, you're going to lunch or something, you're walking to lunch and you're just walking down the street with a friend of yours, ask them to do, it doesn't even have to be that complex, but like a semi-complex, relatively simple math problem while you're walking, and they will stop walking.
Yeah. Yeah.
They will just stop in their tracks while they calculate because it's too much mental load. They can't do both at the same time. And I think it's hilarious because most people don't even realize they're doing it.
Exactly. That's why it's so dangerous to text and drive.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So dangerous. Because you might be texting and then you're caught up in the texting and you lose track of driving. Right. Mm-hmm. So, it's now you can talk and drive, but as soon as a car swerves in front of you, you're going to stop talking, just like you would stop walking on the sidewalk. Yeah. And you'll stop talking and you'll pay attention to that car in front of you. So all of a sudden your automatic attention becomes you're more conscious of what you're looking at.
And we've all even had the experience where we're driving and let's say there's like some pretty severe weather or somebody almost gets in a wreck in front of us or just something bananas happens on the freeway while we're driving. And we almost instinctively turn the music down so that we can focus more.
Yes.
We know this about ourselves. So the fact that people text and drive, it's horrifically dangerous. And I guess the important question then, and obviously this is, there's so much more that we could get into. I can't keep you all day, but the important question that I keep coming back to is, so we have all this good evidence. We know that it's the case that we shouldn't be, multitasking. We know that it's the case that we should be amplifying or working to extend, I guess you can say, our attention spans and kind of practicing how to attend to things more thoughtfully, more mindfully. But like, how do we do it living in a world that feels like it was just built for the opposite? Like every pressure we have on us is to not pay attention, or it's to pay attention for 2 seconds and then switch our attention again.
Yeah. So there are a lot of things we can do. One of the most important things we can do is make sure that you have enough attentional resources available. How do you do that? Getting a good night's sleep is so important. And we tend not to do that. We tend to accumulate sleep debt. And what sleep debt means is that if you need 8 hours of sleep a night, I need 8 hours of sleep. But if you're only getting 6 hours a night, then there's a debt. And as you accumulate sleep debt, as you're continually getting only 6 hours of sleep and not the full 8 hours you need, your debt increases. And in our research, we find there's a correlation that as the debt increases, our attention spans decrease, and people tend to spend more and more time on lightweight activities like social media because they just don't have the resources to do hard work. So we tend to do what's easy. So getting a good night's sleep is so important, and taking sufficient and meaningful breaks. Many of us just tend to work straight through, and that's my nature. And I used to do that and would just get myself exhausted and even burnt out. And it would be the end of the day, and I was just spent. And that is just a terrible idea. It's so important to take a break. That the best break is to walk outside. And there are studies that show that even a 20-minute walk in nature can really restore us. And we've done a study that shows that it benefits divergent thinking. So people can, when you come back after a walk outside, people have better ideas and more ideas. But I also realize it's, circumstances don't always allow to take a 20-minute break every day. So, get up, move around. There are other things you can do, but you can also do just rote activity, simple work or simple activity that engages you, that's easy, that calms you. We find that people are actually happiest when they do this kind of rote activity, and whatever works for you. For some people, I've talked about people who have a golf putter in their office, or someone might do knitting, or playing easy crossword puzzles, or whatever it is that works for you that can relax you. But the important thing is to be strategic. So the last thing you want to do is to play, let's say, a simple game, and then you just get stuck on it. We can't do that. So you have to, you can set a timer if that's what it takes. I very often will wait. I might do it before I have a meeting, so that I know I'm going to have to stop when that meeting starts, and it just gives me a short chance to unwind. And I read about some very famous scientists, artists, musicians who've done rote activity to help them unwind. And one of my favorites is Beethoven used to pour water over his hands, right? This is so crazy. He would pour water back and forth over his hands, over the water basin. And that, apparently helped calm him. And he actually thought of musical compositions while he was doing that. The writer Maya Angelou used to do crossword puzzles. She called that her little mind. Uh, and she also had her big mind where she did her important work, which used deep thought. So, doing some kind of rote activity can be beneficial. But again, we have to be very strategic so that we don't, obviously we can't do it all day. You have to set limits, but a few minutes doing it can help.
Yeah, I definitely find that when I'm working from home, obviously it's different when I'm at work, but when I'm working from home, the walks that I take with my dog around my block are such an important part of sort of breaking up my day. I get sun on my face. I move a little bit. I, get to engage with him, and then I feel like when I come back, I'm in a different headspace than when I left, like a completely different headspace.
I always schedule exercise into my day so that I can be
Mhm.
outside. I put it intentionally into my schedule. And if I don't do it, my day would just fly by and I
Right,
wouldn't
yeah.
exercise. So I have to intentionally do that. And I do it in the middle of my day. I usually do it after I've done a period of hard work, after I know that my attention had been at its peak focus, and then I start feeling tired. I know I can predict that that's the time when I'm going to need to go out and do exercise. I realize living in Southern California is, it's easy to get outside. But I think doing any kind of exercise anywhere is also really beneficial as a way to help restore our thinking.
There's one other thing I wanted to mention that I do that I find incredibly helpful that literally, like when I tell people I do this, it like blows their minds, even though it's such a simple thing and all of us used to do this, is that I don't bring my phone into my bedroom at night. I have an alarm clock, like an actual, like I purchased an alarm clock on Amazon, like a real one that I plug into the wall that has a backup battery in case the power goes out. And I set my alarm clock. And then I put my phone in my desk. And I find that it helps with so many things. It keeps me from doom scrolling at night before I go to sleep. I get to bed at a better time. Um, Obviously, I'm not stuck to my screen, but also it's not the first thing I see when I wake up in the morning, which I find is really good for my mental health. To not like grab my phone and instantly be like, "Who's texted me? What are my notifications? What's on the news today? What's going on Instagram?" Like that, it's not healthy for me to look at that first thing in the morning.
Oh, absolutely. I so agree with you. Um, the best thing is to step outside and get some fresh air and get light. That's the best thing we can do. It's not a good idea to start your day looking at your devices. A lot of people ask me, well, what about just doing a detox, just completely getting away from technology? And I am not in favor of that because for the following. We live in a technological world. The ship has sailed, right? We have technology around us. And instead, let's learn to live with it. But let's learn to live with it in an intelligent way where we're not getting ourselves exhausted and we can use it and still maintain positive well-being. That's the real challenge.
Yeah, yeah.
We technology for work. We need to communicate with our loved ones, our family, friends. We need it for work, but let's use it in such a way that we can still be healthy. We can preserve our mental health, our well-being, and be able to use its benefits without getting sucked up into all the negativity that exists with current technology.
Yeah, I agree. I think looking at a digital detox from like a more clinical perspective is no different than crash dieting. It's no different than abstinence only education. It's no different than the way that, I often liken it unto treatment for eating disorders versus treatment for drug and alcohol problems, which historically drug and alcohol treatment was all about abstinence. And for some people, yes, that works. But I do think that, like, when you look at somebody who's struggling with an eating disorder, you can't be like, okay, just don't eat. Like,
Right.
that's,
Right.
you have to develop a healthy relationship with food.
That's
You just
right.
have to, because you need food to live. And we live in a world where technology is part of our world. We have to develop a healthy relationship. It's so much easier to just go, okay, I'm just going to unplug everything, but it's not sustainable. And then what ends up happening, you just fall right back off the wagon. You go right to your old habits. It's about developing new habits,
That's
healthy
right.
habits.
That's right. Exactly. Crash diets, they work for a while, but then you go back exactly to your bad habits. And it's the same with technology. You can do a digital detox. That's fine for a short time, but then you go right back to your bad habits. What we need to do is relearn our relationship with technology and to relearn how we can use it in a healthy way. And we have to develop agency with our attention to be able to control our attention, in the way that William James, the father of psychology, talked about, so that we're the ones in the driver's seat. We can direct our attention according to our goals. And I'm an optimist. I believe we can do that. I believe everyone can do that.
Well, it's funny because as I close the show, I usually ask my guests two big picture questions. I ask them to look to the future and to tell me what is the thing that they are most worried about, concerned about, maybe even feeling a bit cynical about, and then where are they finding their optimism? What are they genuinely hopeful for and looking forward to? And I'm curious, do you feel like you just answered that question, or would you have a different answer than what you just mentioned?
I do feel that I answered that. I could add something to it.
Hmm.
I think in a very ironic way. I think that technology can provide us with answers to help us gain control over our use of technology. So I've done some work with colleagues at Microsoft Research where we tested a what's called a smart personal assistant. This is software, basically, that can detect, how long a person is working, whether you're spending too much time on social media, whether you're checking email too often. And we know that people check email on average 77 times a day, which is
Jeez, wow.
yeah, that's quite a lot. Uh, but having, I see potential for this kind of, what's called an intelligent assistant, which incorporates AI that can really understand the individual and can serve as a coach that can help you become aware of your behaviors and learn how to retrain ourselves so that we're not checking email 77 times a day. Um, but I do think that we do need some kind of coach. This could be very helpful. And so I do see potential that technology can offer solutions. I also, another thing I would mention is I would like to see design teams who design technology to include psychologists on the teams.
Right.
So
Yeah.
people individuals as part of the design team that really understand humans, that understand how people react to technology, that understand human behavior, so that they can help shape the way that technology is designed. So that's rare. I have sat on such design teams, but usually it's engineers and computer scientists who design the technology, and then we're using that technology. But I would say that humans need a voice, and we need representatives on that design team that can represent what's best for humans in terms of their well-being.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's such an important insight and great. I don't know. I wouldn't call it advice, but hopefully that we see that more and more, especially with the expertise of individuals like you calling for it. So listen. I mean, I've kept you longer than I said that I would. Is there anything that that before we say goodbye, you feel like we didn't touch on, or anything that you want to kind of point to before we close up the show?
I would just say that the bigger message is that, technology has extended our capability as humans. We can do more than we ever have been able to do before. But as a result, people tend to think, well, let's be as productive as possible by
Right.
squeezing as much
Uh-huh.
tasks and work into the shortest amount of time, because technology offers us that possibility. It offers us the possibility to exchange messages with people and to be able to produce content and consume content. And I would say let's reframe our thinking and think, instead of trying to maximize our productivity, let's maximize our well-being. And productivity will come along the way, because if you have the enough mental resources, you've got your full capacity, you will do more, and you will be more efficient and more productive. So let's put the well-being first.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such an important insight and great advice for sure. So listen, everyone. The book is Attention Span: Finding Focus and Fighting Distraction by Dr. Gloria Mark. Gloria, thank you so much for spending some time with us and opening our eyes to this. I guess this issue, obviously, something that our eyes are always open to, but maybe we could attend to a little bit more. So thank you for that.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.